The last of the United Kingdom's executions took place in 1964. Capital punishment overall was abolished in the United Kingdom in 1969, and in Northern Ireland was abolished in 1973. It wasn't until 1998 that we finally totally 100% abolished capital punishment for treason. It took the abolition movement nearly 100 years to achieve their goals here in the UK. The Children's Act of 1908 ensured that children under 16 could no longer be executed. That wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things. It wasn't until 1933 that the Children's and Young People's Act passed, preventing 18 years and younger from being executed as well. In fact, it wasn't until 2 years prior, in 1931, that an act was signed in preventing pregnant women from being executed too. Between the years of 1900 and 1949, 1,210 people were sentenced to death in the United Kingdom. 621 of the men and 11 of the women would subsequently be executed. The remainder achieved clemency or reprieve. Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alex and welcome back to the Irate Alex channel, and today guys is another episode of True IRL, the true crime series here on the channel, and I hope you guys have been enjoying the recent true crime live streams along with the video content too. A couple of weeks ago, while streaming to Twitch, it's twitch.tv/IrateAlex, shameless shill, there, I carried out a True Crime Tuesday research livestream wherein I looked up and read through the details surrounding the last of the UK's executed, the last of the UK's damned. And whilst on that livestream, I did decide that I would try to make a short video series speaking about the people involved in this. And today we're speaking about Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be executed in the UK. But before we get round to Ruth Ellis, I'd like to read a quote. "It is queer to look back and think that only a dozen years ago the abolition of the death penalty was one of those things that every enlightened person advocated as a matter of course, like divorce reform or the independence of India. Now, on the other hand, it is a mark of enlightenment, not merely to approve of executions, but to raise an outcry because there are not more of them." George Orwell. When a murderer is hanged, there is only one person at the ceremony who is not guilty of murder. Also George Orwell. George Orwell would not live long enough to see the abolition and the end come to the United Kingdom's death penalty, but there he was referring to a time in which he served as a imperial police officer in Burma, in which he witnessed a man being hanged. He didn't know what the man was being executed for. He just knew that the man had been told that day he was going to hang and wrote about his experience watching that go down. The first quote, he speaks on the general outcry from the public as the abolition movement was generally started. The sentiment was generally started by the Labour government, the major left-leaning party here in the UK. And George Orwell is subsequently calling out the hypocrisy of all of this, the greater sentiment that would eventually go on to see the abolition of the death penalty, to see the end of capital punishment. Because whilst most enlightened people wanted to see an end to the death penalty, those same people called for the deaths of the Nazis who stood trial at Nuremberg. And I do believe that George Orwell did actually take the stance that he stood against the execution of said Nazis. Now, the death penalty, capital punishment, is a topic that I think it's fair for me to assume that the vast majority of us have that morbid curiosity surrounding it. Even people who live in countries where capital punishment is still very much alive and well, places like America. Hence why there are so many documentaries about death row. Here in the UK, we are particularly fascinated by this as well. I am. Now, when it comes to death row, when it comes to capital punishment, I used to be very, very pro death penalty. I used to be very, very pro. I'm not anti-death penalty. I'm not anti-capital punishment. The fact is I don't take a stance on this now because of my searing emotion that I experience whenever I hear about a horrid individual who's carried out some of the worst heinous crimes in society and how they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison. And I always think to myself, that person deserves far worse. And not just that, but there have been many cases over the years wherein innocent men and women have been executed because things like the forensic evidence was destroyed, or eyewitnesses got something wrong, or something along those lines. And I cannot sit here in good judgment and good standing and give the direct hard stance either way. That said, I did decide some time ago, whilst I was live streaming and discussing the topic of innocent men and women who had been executed by the state, that I should perhaps carry out a video series wherein I give voice to these individuals. Now, when it comes to the stances on this, you guys are more than welcome to express your opinions down below in the comment section on this, but I do ask that you are respectful to each other on this one and have an actual decent discussion. I know that the death penalty is like one tier down in terms of just heated debate, if we can use those terms. It's one tier down from abortion. So let's try not to tear each other's faces apart over that topic, shall we? So on to Ruth Ellis. Ruth Ellis was born on the 9th of October 1926 and grew up in Rhyl, Wales. That's the north of Wales, and was subsequently executed at Holloway prison on the 13th of July 1955. Ruth Ellis walked into the hangman's execution chamber and simply asked that a crucifix be fixed to the wall so that she could keep her eyes on it as she walked the steps, and was subsequently hung, meaning the crucifix was the last thing that she saw, and that was her final request. But how did it come to this? It's not that often we hear about women, especially dainty, pretty women like Ruth Ellis, getting into circumstances wherein murder is the end result. And it's even rarer when it's the woman stood over the top of a jilted lover firing shots into his body. Well, in order to understand Ruth, we have to start from the beginning. Now, as I said, she did grow up in Rhyl, but as a child, she was the fifth of six, and they subsequently did move down south. Now, not a lot of information was available about Ruth's childhood. That said, she did leave home at the age of 14, and she proceeded to move to London at the age of 14 to go work as a waitress. Now, Ruth did whatever she had to do to get by, and if she wasn't waiting tables, then she was working in factories or taking clerical jobs where she was able to. Things did briefly start to look up for Ruth when she turned 17. She met a Canadian soldier, and they subsequently had a child together. That said, the Canadian soldier did leave Ruth behind, but did send money for roughly a year before stopping those payments. In order to balance her life out, in order to live alone and be able to continue working at the time, Ruth thought it best that she send her son to go live with her mother, and so off he was sent, and she continued on her path. After sending her son away to live with her mother, a very unfortunate set of circumstances, as is the vast majority of Ruth's life, to be perfectly honest with you guys. I mean, can you imagine the 1930s, 1940s, World War II is raging, and you're a very young Ruth Ellis, living in London, living through the Blitz, and trying to get by. Difficult stuff, very difficult stuff. Ruth later went on and landed herself a job as a model, nude modeling. And of course, this job, it would have put her in a position wherein men would have looked at her and probably would have called her names, would have called her a hussy. She would have been seen by people in that light, especially back then in a very hardline, conservative, very traditional Great Britain. And of course, back then, being a young lady working in that particular type of industry did put her at some risk. And one of those risks was, of course, dirty perverts. And her boss, Maurice Conley, well, he was known for blackmailing his models into sleeping with him. And whether Ruth actually ever did this, I do not know, but I can imagine he probably did do this to her as well. So life goes on, and World War II comes to an end, and 5 years passed, and we are now at 1950. And Ruth decides to take up prostituting, which, as you can imagine, probably didn't help her in her public standing, help her reputation, help her relationship with her family. But of course, nude modeling and prostitution paid far better than working in factories or clerical jobs or working as a waitress. But as with the vast majority of Ruth's attempts to simply live her best life, she became pregnant again. And this was via one of her regulars that she tended to, that she provided her time to. And unfortunately, she decided to have an abortion, illegally, especially back then. And I imagine this would have put her at even greater risk. I imagine the procedure was far more traumatic than it probably needed to be. But Ruth, seemingly unfazed, carried on. And she went straight back to working the streets. And it's at this point where everything starts to compact together for Ruth. Everything seems to happen really quickly in comparison. Everything starts piling up and piling up and piling up. Later that year, in November of 1950, the same year that she had been prostituting and had an illegal abortion, she married a 41-year-old, extremely jealous, extremely violent and abusive 41-year-old dentist. This was George Ellis, and George was a violent alcoholic, and he also came pre-packaged with 2 sons. In the UK, we call this a pot noodle family. You know, you just add dad, you know. I was referred to as that, and I didn't get it at first, but I was just like, oh yeah, just add dad, just add mummy, I get it. Now, unfortunately, this was one of those relationships, one of those extremely uber toxic relationships, wherein they'd have a fight, George would get violent, he'd be drunk, Ruth would leave, but she kept coming back. And George was very possessive and extremely paranoid. And when I spoke about this on live stream, I had to ask the question, if you knew that you were a jealous man, if you knew that you had any kind of jealous streak within you, that you were a possessive individual, then why oh why did you marry someone who was simply working the streets, someone who was prostituting merely months ago? I do have to ask that question. Because if you go into a relationship knowing these things and get married knowing these things, and surely you do not have a right to complain about them, let alone take out your frustrations violently against this much smaller woman. This relationship was just incredibly toxic. This relationship was unfathomable, truly. The opinion George had of Ruth I don't even understand why he agreed in the first place to get married to her, because in 1951, Ruth appeared in a movie. Lady Godiva Rides Again. Ruth was actually in that movie as an extra, but she was uncredited. Now, at the time, she was actually pregnant with George's baby. And when Ruth gives birth, he decides that he doesn't want anything to do with that baby. He doesn't want anything to do with Ruth. He just completely cuts them off and walks away. Now, considering everything Ruth has been through up until this point, it's quite a lot in my opinion, at least. You know, she's born in the 20s. She grows up throughout the 30s. She's got a job during World War II, during the Blitz, during World War II. And she's had abortions, she's prostituted, she's been blackmailed, presumably. She's been in violent, horrid relationships, she's been abandoned. And the reason why I mention this is because during the trial process, she was mentally evaluated twice. And there was nothing wrong with her, apparently. Now, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, but had I been through the things that she had, and seen the things that she'd seen, and experienced what she had, I would probably be depressed, possibly, maybe even a bit anxious. You'd think somebody would walk away from these kind of things with at least PTSD. But I suppose not everyone experiences such things, perhaps. I don't know. I am not a qualified individual, and I certainly couldn't assess her now, even if I was. And life went on for Ruth, but later on, Ruth meets a hard-drinking racer. His name is David Blakely. She meets him through a friend, a racing friend, called Mike Hawthorne. And this is very much a constant in Ruth's life. Now, despite everything that she's done and despite her reputation, she has mingled with quite a few celebrities in her time. And this also meant she got to know race car drivers and people of that ilk. Now, when she met David Blakely was engaged to another woman, but it only took several weeks before he moved in with her into her flat above the club that she was now managing. But like her husband before him, David had an alcohol problem, and he liked to get violent. Lots of abusive men in Ruth's life. Lots of abusive men. It's not surprising that it ended the way it did. Although the actual scenario is surprising, if I'm honest. I would have thought that it would have been a case of Ruth, lashing out in response to an act of violence. But that's not how it went down. But we will get there, of course. And she continued with David Blakely, and it didn't take long for Ruth to become pregnant again, but she decided to terminate the pregnancy early on, as she didn't believe that she could have a long-lasting relationship with David Blakely. At this point, Ruth clearly just doesn't care and decides to form a relationship with a former RAF pilot, Desmond Cusson, and he was somebody who had inherited his family business, which was tobacco retail, and this was a nice, stable, wealthy individual for Ruth to marry into, or at least attempt to stick with. And she actually moved in with him not long after, kind of separating from David, even though they continued to do the naughty, do the bad thing repeatedly. And that was something that caused more issues between Ruth and David, because they were both screwing around, and Ruth was no longer living with David. So there was an incredible amount of jealousy on both parties' part, which is insane to me. Because if you're fooling around with different people, and you've got this weird kind of messed up love triangle, then what's the deal? Yeah, you know what I mean? And David thought that he could solve this issue, this problem, this toxicity between them by proposing, because proposing always fixes relationships, doesn't it? That's like one tier above saying, let's have a baby to fix our relationship. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. And Ruth became pregnant again. And unfortunately, she miscarried because she had an argument with David, a drunken argument, and he punched her in the stomach, causing the miscarriage. So at this point, you have Ruth, and Ruth goes to live with Desmond, and Desmond has his business. She's lost her job managing the little club, and she's periodically engaging in naughty fun time with David Blakely, who's also a raging alcoholic and extremely toxic and extremely violent, and they're both messing around, and this just starts to snowball and snowball and snowball. And all of this came to a head on the 10th of April, 1955, Easter Sunday. Now, David Blakely is at a friend's, and he gets up to go leave and starts driving off in his car. At the exact same time, you have Ruth, who is looking for him. And she appears at his friend's home. He's just left, so she decides that she's going to take the 1/4 mile stroll to Magdala. And the Magdala is a very, very large pub. And he quite clearly managed to get 1 or 2 drinks in and is walking out of the pub when Ruth says, "Hello, David," and he ignores her, and she shouts at him, and he continues to ignore her, and he walks to his car, and he's fumbling with his keys, and this made Ruth really, really mad. So mad, in fact, she pulled out her .38 caliber revolver out of her purse and fired a shot at him, and the first shot missed. A little run around the car then happens, and Ruth fires the second shot, which downs David, and he hits the road. She then stands over his body and empties a further 3 into him. And then the 6th shot hits the road, ricochet, and hits a member of the public, injuring them. David Blakely is dead, and Ruth Ellis is eerily calm at this point. Even speaking to an off-duty police officer, knowing him by name and saying, "Are you going to arrest me now, Clive?" And she's arrested, taken to the police station, and completely calmly just admits guilt to everything. Explains everything 100% truthfully, and that's it. That's pretty much it. It wasn't that long until she was actually taken to the Old Bailey, where she turned up looking dapper as anything, all decked out, makeup, blouse, all the works, and stood there and very calmly admitted guilt. So she's made a full confession, and she's also done the same thing at the Old Bailey, and this happens on the 20th of June 1955. Prior to this, she had been psychologically evaluated twice, and I do have to question the effort and the expertise of psychologists and psychiatrists back in the 50s of all time. It wasn't that long before that period that we were still executing our own soldiers during World War I for suffering from shell shock, and we didn't really understand what it was, and we didn't do well with things like mental health in the UK for some time. The Labour government's reform of the United Kingdom and the reform of society didn't start until the 50s, of course. And the sentiment for the abolition of the death penalty was a growing thing, and Ruth Ellis's case definitely contributed to that. So, it's the Old Bailey, it's the 20th of June, and the prosecutor steps forward, steps in front of Ruth, and asks her, "What did you intend to do to David when you were stood over his body?" And she simply replied, "It's obvious when I shot him. I intended to kill him." It took the jury at the Old Bailey in 1955, in June 1955, it took them 20 minutes. Just 20 minutes to find her guilty. Now, one would think that this entire case was completely cut and dry. Of course, she completely admitted everything. She was 100% truthful, and she had been evaluated by psychiatrists and psychologists. So, why not? Why not? 20 minutes, in my opinion, is perhaps maybe a little bit too short. I think there is more evidence that should be used, regardless of how the defendant pleads in this particular case. But that's my mere humble opinion. I don't know about you guys. You're more than welcome to give me your opinions down below. So, Ruth Ellis is taken at Her Majesty's pleasure and is taken to Holloway prison, wherein she would wait to be executed. And she spent all of 3 weeks. 3 weeks! Before she was taken from her cell at 9 a.m. on the 13th of July 1955 to the execution chamber and hanged till dead. 3 weeks. No appeals process, apparently, back in the 1950s. Now, like many examples of people that are placed onto death row, there are often petitions. And with Ruth's case, the public already had a growing sentiment. They already wanted to see the end of the capital punishment in the United Kingdom. They wanted to see the end of the death penalty. So when they saw Ruth, this little lady who looked like a scorned lover, and a lot of people had a great deal of sympathy for her, and why not? Why wouldn't you have sympathy for Ruth? After all, she'd experienced hell on earth as far as I'm concerned personally. She'd been abused, she'd been beaten, she'd suffered miscarriages, she'd had to prostitute herself. Her life up until that point was pretty dark. So why wouldn't the public have sympathy towards her? And a petition of 50,000 signatures was signed and sent to the Home Secretary. But they said no. They denied this. And she was executed. She was hanged till dead. She'd only spent 3 weeks in prison, which is baffling to me. And unfortunately, the sadness and the darkness doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. Now, if you've sat here and you've listened to me speak and you think that she deserved to be hanged till dead, or you're rigidly pro-death penalty, well, and you don't think that this is sad, and you don't think that her circumstances were sad, well, maybe you'll hear what happened to some of her family not long afterwards. It would appear that Ruth and her family seemed to be, dare I say, cursed. 3 years after Ruth's execution, her husband, George Ellis, became extremely depressed, became even more of an alcoholic before. I don't know how that's possible, but he delved even further into the bottle and subsequently committed suicide via hanging in a hotel room. 14 years later, her mother, in 1969, it is believed that she attempted suicide by gassing herself in a room in a flat. But luckily she did survive. That said, an incredible amount of damage was done. She survived, but was unable to speak correctly after that point. And if those 2 cases weren't worse enough, Ruth had managed to have enough public support. So much public support post-execution that her body was exhumed from the unmarked grave that they had at Holloway prison, as was the tradition. That's what they did. They executed people and they dumped the bodies into unmarked graves at the prison, and they exhumed her body, then they buried her elsewhere, and the headstone was vandalized and it was desecrated by her son Andy, who then the same day proceeded to go back to his bedsit and commit suicide. Her daughter would only make it to the age of 50 and would pass away from cancer many, many years later. In my opinion, and I think this is probably shared amongst a lot of people, but Ruth Ellis's case and her execution really did contribute to the growing sentiment, the growing desire to see the end of the death penalty in the United Kingdom. She wasn't the last person to be executed in the UK, but she was the last woman. I imagine that her reputation as a former prostitute, as a former nude model, as somebody who probably had a reputation, a very, very negative reputation for having things like abortions illegally, this wouldn't have made her look good. Her reputation would have been one of a hussy, one of a slut, dare I say, especially back then in the 1940s and 50s. And her son was probably bullied mercilessly by other people. The son of a whore, I suppose he was probably called. I don't know, I'm just speculating here. And had Ruth really grown up in the same manner, but in the current year, I think that she would be seen as a progressive, possibly even a feminist hero to many, many people. She was a businesswoman. She was somebody who didn't want to stay at home. She didn't want to look after the kids. She wanted to go out and earn a living for herself. And that's what she knew. And she did what she had to keep a roof over her head and food on her table. It's just very, very unfortunate that the men that she met in her life were abusive scumbags that beat women. But that concludes the end of this first part of The Last of the Damned. If you enjoyed this video, if you liked it, please consider sharing it. Please consider smashing the like button. Let me know what your thoughts are down below in the comments. And thank you guys very much, especially if you got this far into the video. I'm still learning how to do true crime, still learning how to format these kinds of videos, and still learning a lot about video editing and things of that nature. So I am very appreciative. So thank you to everybody who stuck around. So thank you very much to everyone sticking around and those who chose to stick around post Hater Nation BS. I really do appreciate that, guys. I really do appreciate it. And of course, I'm mostly appreciative to those people who support via channel memberships and Patreon. These videos often get demonetized, so that is very helpful. So thank you guys for watching. I've been Alex of the Irate Alex channel. This has been True IRL. You've been the Broken Toys, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.